Okay, guys, we're going to officially finish World War One today. We started the other day where you got to look at the actual surrender of the Germans. We watch a short video of that and so on. The other day, we also got to get started on this, and we saw once the war was over with, the main focus was how was Europe going to keep the peace, and that came in the form of the Paris Peace Conference. What came out of the Paris Peace Conference was the Treaty of Versailles, and this was the treaty that officially ended World War One. Specific treaty with Germany, like we talked about in this slide already. Now, over the last couple of days, you guys have been working on a map, and hopefully you got that finished by the start of today's class. One major effect of World War One was that many countries got their own territories and their own sovereignty. So the dual kingdom of Austria-Hungary is going to split up and going to form Austria and Hungary that we know today with their capitals of Vienna and Budapest. So that was one effect of the war geographically. There's going to be new countries that are going to form. One is called Czechoslovakia. The other one is called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is around today. Czechoslovakia is somewhat around today. It has since split in half. The western part is called the Czech Republic, and the eastern part is called Slovakia. So the Czechs, the Slavs, and so on were able to create their territory and gain their sovereignty after World War I, which you labeled. Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq. It wasn't just countries in Europe. Other countries and territories around the world, especially here in the Middle East, are going to get their start. We see Syria in the news all the time. We see Iraq in the news sometimes. And definitely Transjordan, which is now Jordan, have their sovereignty, have their territories, and so on. Russia is going to lose a little bit of territory after World War I. Finland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania are going to become their own territories, have their own countries, have their own capitals, and so on. Finland has their thriving capital of Helsinki to this day. Finland used to be a Russian territory. And then the old Slavic ethnic groups of the Estonians and the Latvians and the Lithuanians, where great basketball is played, they're going to gain their territory. And to this day, they are countries, they are capitals, and they're going to get their start, so to speak, after World War I. Minority groups are going to still suffer, though. They're still going to, now, Estonia, the Latvias of the world, the Czechs, they're going to gain their territories. But another effect of World War I is that not everyone will gain sovereignty. Not everyone are going to gain their territories. So still, even after World War I, there are going to be minority groups that are still going to suffer in the old colonies, all right? During the age of imperialism, there's still going to be colonies. There's still going to be countries around the world that are going to be in charge of other places around the world, all right? So that's not going to change after World War I. Now, if you did your map, you'll see that your map should look like this. It looks like, pretty much Europe that we have today, all right? So it's looking like a modern Europe, so to speak, and so on, minus some new countries that are going to form out of the old Yugoslavian territory there. But that's what your map should have looked like, and that's the map and the capitals that you should have done. Now, we're going to talk about in the second part of class today the provisions of the treaty. Provisions basically means what the Treaty of Versailles provided for. Now, one thing that the treaty provided for, and it's somewhat of an effect that lasts to this day directly and indirectly, is that it formed the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is going to be an international group that we're going to finish with today that's going to supposed to promote peace and cooperation. It's not going to be it's not going to be around very long, and we'll talk about that why. Now, another thing that the treaty provided for was that they really hit Germany hard. So the Treaty of Versailles is going to hit Germany in the pocketbook. Remember, the other day we talked about, possibly $30 billion as a guesstimate of how much Germany is going to have to pay back the world. Now, another thing that Germany lost is land in France. They're going to lose land. So they're going to lose land in France, they're going to lose land in Belgium, and they're going to lose land in Poland, all right? And that will come back to haunt the world in Europe eventually. Now, they tried to handcuff Germany and said that they were not allowed to have an army of more than 100,000 troops, all right? You can still have an army, Germany, but it cannot have more than 100,000 troops, okay? And that's a pretty big deal. That's not a very big army at all compared, being that at the start of World War I, Britain had the smallest army, and they had 1 million troops, okay? So compare that to the Germans being handcuffed and only allowed an army of 100,000 troops. Now, absolutely no more weapons and absolutely no more subs, all right? So the world said, Germany, your machine gun, all your weapons that you created is really going to heighten World War I and basically start it. Your unrestricted submarine warfare, your U-boats, you can't have those anymore. So you are not to manufacture or produce any of those weapons or U-boats anymore. They were allowed to have 6 warships, all right? The German Navy after World War I was allowed to keep 6 warships, and there's a really famous event on June 21st, 1919 in the North Sea where the Germans literally sunk their fleet, literally sunk their Navy ships, sunk their U-boats and other things that, you know, caused devastation in World War I. Now, the problem with this was that the Allies were going to find it really hard to enforce these laws. Okay? It wasn't like the Americans and the British and the French were going to have lifeguard stands of men and soldiers watching the Germans keep their end of the bargain, not making weapons, not making U-boats, not having a standing army of more than 100,000 troops. And you know, World War I, the fighting ends in 1919. World War II's fighting starts in 1939. So 20 years later, only 20 years after World War I ended, World War II is going to start. And one of the major effects of the Allies finding it really hard to make Germany do these things is World War II. And later on this week, we're going to find out a guy named Adolf Hitler that hated the Treaty of Versailles and is going to violate every single part of the Treaty of Versailles as much as possible. Now, we're going to finish today with the League of Nations, and one thing that was supposed to do was to promote international cooperation. When problems happened around the world, they were going to have armies sent to settle these disputes. Now, the League of Nations also worked really, really hard to reduce armaments, to reduce weaponry, to reduce the manufacture of tanks and machine guns and grenades and the devastating poison gas that had such horrible effects on soldiers in World War I. That was the ultimate goal, was to keep the peace by doing this. Now, with that said, the League of Nations was going to work very closely with the World Court in the Netherlands, the Hague, where if there was someone that, like I said in the first lesson we had on World War I, that did horrible things to many countries in the world, they would be sent to the World Court, all right? So the League of Nations was going to work in cooperation with the World Court. Now, Great Britain and Italy and France and Germany and the United States were the creators of the League of Nations. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, is going to write the foundations. A lot of his 14 points that we talked about in our last lesson will be included in the League of Nations doctrine and so on. Now, if disputes arose around the world, penalties were going to be enforced, okay? So what are penalties? Well, penalties are sanctions. Maybe you wouldn't be sending oil to these places anymore. Maybe no more steel. Maybe no more iron. Maybe different things that countries need to build a war force. There would be sanctions, no more money, no more trading, no more food, maybe higher tariffs. And then if push came to shove, well then obviously military intervention if problems came about. Now, one of the great facts about the League of Nations is that the United States never joined. They never joined the League of Nations. This was like Woodrow Wilson's baby. He was very outspoken when the League of Nations was being formed. We were an original creator of it. However, we never joined. We signed a separate treaty, a specific separate treaty with Germany, and that's how we're going to end our war officially. Now, you guys are probably asking, why did we never sign it? Why did we take so much interest to write the doctrine, the framework of it? Why was Woodrow Wilson so outspoken of having it? Why in the world did we never join the League of Nations? Well, it goes back to an original answer to the question of why we never joined the war, and why we didn't join the war until later in the war. When the war ended, there was still the Atlantic Ocean separating us, and we really felt that if there was, God forbid, another major event that happened in Europe, we didn't want any parts of it. We were still going to practice our policy of isolationism, isolated on the other part of the world, on the other part of the ocean. So we never joined it. Now, eventually, 42 members met in Geneva, Switzerland in November of 1920. They initially met, and that's how many countries joined, so it was a really good thing. You would think that there would never, ever be another war again with 42 members. 59 members eventually were a part of the League of Nations. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that the League did was they let Germany in 1926. When they let Germany in, they took their eyes off of Germany. They took their eyes off of Germany. And remember this for a lesson in our very, very near future. And they even let the Russians in, the communists in, by this time in 1934. So by then, the League of Nations basically was going to be very weak. Now, it only lasted 20 years. It's going to dissolve during World War II, just a little bit more than 20 years, and it's going to actually form what we call the United Nations today, which it will form into, but not till after the war. Now, I always like to finish by looking at some numbers, all right? And this chart gives you a real good idea of casualties of World War I. As you're glancing at this, and you can have time to look at it afterwards, I mean, you can just look at it separated by the Central Powers there at the bottom and the Allied powers there at the top. Usually you look at Russia's numbers, and if you concentrate on Russia's numbers for a while, man, boy, they had the most casualties because they had the most soldiers that fought in this war. So Russia, we're talking 1 or 5, 7.5. I mean, we're talking almost 10 million casualties in World War I just for Russia itself. You can see those huge numbers. You know, if you look at the Central Powers, you look at the United States, and I would always ask you a question about, well, why did the United States lose so few men, casualties, and so on? And obviously the answer is because we joined the war very late, towards the end of the war. We always focus on the Central Powers down there at the bottom. You can see how devastating Germany was. Now, as you're looking at this, you know, these countries didn't really keep, Russia did not keep accurate numbers of casualties in warfare and so on. Germany's not going to keep an accurate count. These are just pretty much guesstimates, and they're pretty good, but all these numbers can basically increase, all right, simply because they didn't do a very good job of keeping track of casualties and so on. So if you look at the grand total down there at the bottom, you can see the known dead, the seriously wounded, the hurt, the sick, the prisoners and missing. I mean, the grand total of casualties in World War I was, let's say, 1630, you know, about 36 to 37 million casualties there were in World War I. And once you see that number, remember that number of around 35 to 37 million casualties, because the numbers at the end of World War II are going to be even more devastating than that. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you guys about is a country that is considered the biggest loser of World War I. This country had the largest percentage of the total population killed or wounded. Half of the 20 to 32-year-old men were killed in this country. 300,000 houses, 20,000 factories were destroyed. 1,360,000 head of livestock were killed. Artillery is going to damage thousands of acres of forest and land. Now, as you're looking at that, you can see the one really, really devastating number there is half of the 20 to 32-year-old men were killed in this country. Now, those are kids that should be out of college, starting families, you know, starting families and so on. So that's really going to affect this country's population for time to come. So everybody at once, when I say 3, yell out the country that you think it is. 1, 2, 3. Usually you say Germany, usually you say Russia, usually you say France, usually you say every country out there. I always get a million different countries. But really the biggest loser of World War I is France. The French are going to lose so much, and 20 years later, when World War II starts, there is absolutely no way that the French are going to be able to fight or even think about fighting in another war. And that will officially end World War II.